Hello, everyone. Hi. Thanks for joining today's webinar session on the roles and responsibilities within an apprenticeship journey, sort of how to get more from your apprenticeship program. So today's session is delivered by Rachel Roby. Rachel is a strategic apprenticeship lead at Cogent Skills. Rachel's got sort of vast amount of experience in the field of apprenticeships, really. Prior to current role, Rachel's worked closely with colleges, training providers, and employers. And sort of passionately believes that apprenticeships are the way to learn and progress in life. So Rachel's got a slide deck to go through today. It'll be her voice that's sort of leading us through this session. If you've got any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in through the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screens. I should say the session's been recorded, and a copy of that recording can be available afterwards. We've got about 45 minutes for today's session, and I guess there'll be some time for Q&A at the end as well. So look, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rachel to take you through today's presentation.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining me this Tuesday lunchtime. Hope everybody's well. So yes, thank you for joining me today. So this is the next webinar in the series of webinars that I've been putting on since I've been here at Cogent. Previous ones are available via the Science Industry Partnership YouTube channel, and this is where this one will go. But for the next half an hour, 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking about the roles and responsibilities within an apprenticeship journey, looking at the different roles involved, different responsibilities, and then some questions and some food for thought for all you to take back into your internal departments around how you can be getting more out of your relationships and your roles and responsibilities. So the aim of today is to support your understanding, so to provide some help, tips on the roles and responsibilities within the journey, and to make sure you are getting the most out of your programs. During the session, we will be covering the apprenticeship journey and the key stakeholders, roles and responsibilities of the employer, the training provider, the endpoint assessment organisation, and also a little bit at the end around the regulators. You'll hear a lot of terminology of regulators used within apprenticeship journey. So it's just to give you a bit of understanding about who the regulators are and why they are involved in the apprenticeship journey. So the first visual slide that I just wanted to present to you was a stakeholder and journey visual. You'll see that this is split into three sections. So our sign up, our pre-program sign up, our on-program learning, and then our endpoint assessment. And you'll see a bit of a visual of what's involved during those sections of the apprenticeship program, along with the key stakeholders that are involved. So you'll see from the sign up, so this is before the apprentice has signed anything and before yourself has signed anything, all of the paperwork, all of the discussions of the program planning, and crucially those initial assessments. And during that process, it's really fundamental that the candidate, so the prospective apprentice, the employer and the training provider all have a key role in that process. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail as we move on. Then we move on to the on-program learning. So again, the visual will outline the learning and development opportunities that the apprentice will have, the on-the-job and the off-the-job training requirements, and then the English and maths. Now, I've underarched English and maths from that initial assessment to Gateway, just because that experience of English and maths will start from those initial assessments. And what I would say is, just because many of your learners may have exemptions from English and maths, there is still a responsibility for that upskilling and continuous improvement on English and maths through the apprenticeship programme. So some people would discount English and maths if you are able to produce your certificates, but there is responsibilities for English and maths development throughout. And then we get to Gateway, and there is a new rule that came in this year's funding rules around the endpoint assessment organisation, and that is labelled as EPAO within the stakeholder section. In the past, Gateway was obviously when all of the discussions took place to ensure that the learner, the employer and the training provider was happy that the learner was ready to go through to the endpoint assessment. The new rule that's come in this year is that engagement with endpoint assessment organisations should be taking place well before the end of programme, and they are stipulating a minimum 6 months before gateway is that you have your contracts in place and you have your agreements in place with the endpoint assessment organisation. This is something that should have been put in a long time ago, if you ask for my opinion, but it's something that's really going to strengthen the relationships between an endpoint assessment organisation, the training provider and the learner, and make sure that the learner is getting any of the resources, any of the preparation materials, any advice and guidance from the endpoint assessment organisation prior to them getting ready to go through gateway. And then once all those agreements have been met, they'll go through gateway and they'll enter their endpoint assessment time. And again, the stakeholders stay the same. So some would say that the training provider may drop off when the learner goes through gateway, but the training provider is responsible from the day the learner signs up officially, but obviously they're involved before, right till the end, until that learner has their certificate. So they have to stay involved, and they should want to stay involved all the way through endpoint assessment. And that can be in various formats that we'll talk about later on. So that's just a quick visual of the stakeholders. It really emphasises as a quick visual as to what the stages of an apprenticeship programme are, but also who are the key players that should be involved in all of those stages. So the role and responsibility of the employer. So employing apprentices can support growth plans within a company, either for emerging talent or succession planning. And this is the differences between taking on a new person to become an apprentice and learn, or whether that's your upskilling and your retraining elements of your apprenticeship policy. Apprenticeships provide employees with a real life work experience as well as a structured programme of learning with the support of a training provider. So just to take you around the visual of some of the key responsibilities that you have as employers. So supporting the recruitment process. So obviously if you're taking somebody on from scratch and you're taking them on under an apprenticeship contract, or you're taking them on as a permanent full-time, part-time member of your staff and you're going to enrol them on an apprenticeship, you must be ensuring that during that recruitment process, you are open with them about what is to come. So talking to them about the apprenticeship programme, how that will fit into their jobs, what element of their jobs will be related to the apprenticeship and how they will get the support. But it's really important that you're happy with who you're taking on, that they're fit for the role that you want them to do, for the role that you want them to become competent in order for them to succeed in their role, but also in their apprenticeship. Obviously, that isn't applicable when you already have a member of staff on your payroll and you want them to then embark on an apprenticeship programme. But obviously for new people, the recruitment process is really important and to get them really a good starting point. During all of this, obviously, if you have plans to start apprenticeships or build on your apprenticeship programmes or look at new provision, then engaging with training providers is really important. Having a choice is something that is a luxury, so make sure that you are taking advantage of that and selecting the right employer and the right training provider that's going to suit your needs, is going to meet your business needs, you get a good feel for them, and that you believe that they are as committed as you are to having a positive learning experience for the learner. There's also some, I suppose, prerequisites that might need to be kept in mind, especially for people that you're recruiting. So is the training provider going to meet with them? Are they going to do any initial assessments with them before you offer them a contract? Are you going to take them on and then engage with the training provider? And all these are considerations that need to be made to ensure that you're taking on the right people, but the training provider is also happy with what and who they are taking on this learning journey with you. Obviously, if so as an example, you might take somebody on and they fit everything that you want, they are the perfect candidate for the role, but the training provider might have some concerns from the initial assessments of English and maths that may come out. That isn't necessarily something that you would identify if you don't do initial assessments in your recruitment process, but it's something that the training provider would pick up, and then they would discuss with you what additional support those learners or that learner may need. So engaging with providers early, getting them involved early is really important, but it's really important for you to make sure that you're making the right choices with the providers that you want to work with. Once everything has been sorted out, you've all signed on the dotted line, you've all signed your agreements and you're happy with the plan, it's then providing that ongoing support to the apprentice, ensuring that they're given all the opportunities that they deserve and all of the opportunities to learn as part of the programme. So it's meeting your end of the bargain in terms of the training plan, in terms of the commitment statements that you've signed, and making sure that they get that on programme support. And one of the things that I would say, and it links in very nicely to the next element around the off-the-job learning activities. On the call today, we have a lot of organisation development, L&D, HR functions, and that is great. But you might not be necessarily the direct people that your apprentices internally deal with on a day-to-day basis. You might not be the mentors, you might not be the line managers. So it's really important that you agree the right process to follow in terms of monitoring and making sure that all parties are happening. So one of the things that I would obviously suggest is looking at making sure that you're selecting the right mentors for your apprentices. What involvement are they going to have? What responsibilities do they have? Versus the overall responsibilities of the HR and L&D function, and just making sure that all parties understand their responsibilities and understand where their responsibilities start and end, and where any interventions may need to come in, just to ensure that the apprentice is getting the best learning experience. This also falls into the active role within progress reviews. So for people that might not have a lot of experience in apprenticeships, as part of your agreement and a part of the training provider agreement, they agree to conduct a maximum 12-week progress review. And this should be a sit-down conversation with the manager, mentor, or yourselves, the training provider and the learner, to discuss that 3-month milestone and what they've achieved, what they've done, what's next, setting some targets, and just a general progress review on all aspects of that apprenticeship programme. And it's really important that the right people go to that meeting. So if you decide that you aren't the right person as the L&D function or the HR representative, but the mentor is, then it's really important that you set that up and make sure that that can happen. Playing an active role can be as simple as you getting the paperwork and keeping that centrally stored, or it can be you dipping in maybe every other review and just talking to them, or holding pre or post meetings and catching up with apprentices or managers or providers. Working with a provider to select the most appropriate endpoint assessment organisation is a key part. Lots of providers, and I'll say the word allow very loosely because it's something that's always been the case, have just let their providers select the endpoint assessment organisation. And in the past, there's been nothing wrong with that. Nobody knew any different. But it is fundamental, and it is something that you can be and should be responsible for being involved with. The training provider will have preferences, they will have organisations that they work with currently, they will have recommendations, but you do not have to follow those recommendations as an employer. So being involved in that arrangements, in those discussions, signing those contracts, and making sure that you're playing a part in those conversations is really key. Allowing the training provider to regularly engage. So this is, again, you keeping your end of the bargain in terms of the training plan and making sure that the training provider can see, whether that's virtually or face-to-face, and can undertake teaching and learning with those apprentices. Now, obviously, with the ever-growing changes around COVID, some organisations may have rules in place where training can't happen on site or you can't have visitors. But it's just making sure that you're putting mitigation in place and you're ensuring that the apprentice is getting the best opportunity. So have they got the right technology to engage in any remote learning sessions? Are they having time where they can have sessions with their coach or their mentor or their on-programme tutor, whether that be remotely or whether that be face-to-face? And just making sure that any timetabling clashes with sessions in college or university is all accounted for, and that's set up front and being maintained. All of a sudden, if the college is on a Tuesday, but then something internally happens every Tuesday, which then has a conflict, obviously you sign the agreement to allow that learner to go to college. And if that's their learning day, then that should obviously be precedent. I'm just going to check the chat box just to see if anyone has any questions. No, not yet. I will move on. So I wanted then to highlight some general internal responsibilities and then some responsibilities linked to apprenticeships specifically. So internal responsibilities, obviously general HR regulations, and again, we're full of HR people here today, which is great. So I don't need to teach you about HR regulations, but obviously internal, anything that is responsible for employees will also be responsible for apprentice well-being and health and safety risk assessments, personal assessments that they may need is all, counts under your internal responsibility. They're a member of your team, of your payroll, of your staff. So it's important that you take the responsibility for them. And then responsibilities linked to apprenticeship. So I've put some questions together here, and this is to get you thinking about your contractual obligations, and then there's some other couple in a minute. So questions to pose to you. So do you use your own contracts, or do you always sign the provider's contract? Do you have any conditions within contracts? How up to date with you are you on the contracts for different providers that you have? How confident are you that you know what has been written in the contracts that you've signed with the different providers? And the last one would be, do you have up to date and compliant apprenticeship agreements, commitment statements, and training plans for all your learners? Now, I'm not expecting anybody to speak up. I don't want anyone to be terrified if your answers are all no, but it's just something for you to think about around you having the control around your contracts and the fact that you can put your own conditions in. You can ask for your own contract to be signed. You are entitled to have copies of the apprenticeship agreements, commitment statements, and training plans. And these are things that you should be keeping. And if providers are being funny with you, then you've got every reason to challenge that and ask them for copies. And when I say up to date and compliant, what I would say is a training plan and a commitment statement should be a working document. They are designed on day one, but let's face it, it's real life, and a 12-month to 5-year training plan won't look the same as it did when you're planning it at day one. So they should be a working document. And if the working document changes, you should get updates to those documents. And if dates are changing, if updates are changing in terms of what is being planned when or what is being delivered when, you should have a copy of all of those changes that are being made. And then financial monitoring. So this is linked to the funding rules. So how confident are you with the funding rules to know whether funding is being allocated correctly? So the funding rules is something that I did a session on in the summer when the new funding rules came out. And we can post a link if anybody would find it useful for that session. But funding rules are something that you sign up to and you agree to when you sign onto the Digital Apprenticeship Service, the DAS, and you will regularly receive updates through the academic year when there is an update to the funding rules. And by signing that or by ticking a box, you are agreeing that you are going to remain compliant. So how confident are you? And again, I'm not going to ask anybody to speak up, but it's just something to think about is, when was the last time you looked at the funding rules? Have you ever challenged anything? Are you confident with eligible and ineligible costs when it comes to apprenticeship training? And how closely do you look at the funding that's being quoted for when you are talking to providers? And then the final thing in terms of responsibilities for you to think about is that progress monitoring. And what I would say is the majority of learners nowadays will have an e-portfolio, an electronic portfolio system, and you would or you should have access, and you can have access to it as an employer. And you will see a progress bar. So you will see an intervention has taken place and then the learner's progress has gone up. Now, what does that mean? And it's a question that I constantly ask is, just because the learner has had a teaching session and they've gone up 6%, does that have any impact on what they've learned, what they can do differently, the impact of that? So are you keeping your own internal progress monitoring platforms, graphs, anything to see what impact the training is having? So progress against the learning plan, but also against the overall occupational competency. And some of the things that I've just noted on here are obviously the knowledge, skills, and behaviours that are from the standard. If there's a formal qualification attached to the programme, functional skills, and that wider personal development, so safeguarding, prevent strategy, personal development in terms of communication skills, etc., that are all a part of the apprenticeship programme? And do you have any checks and balances that you're using internally to make sure that the learner is progressing? Okay, moving on to the provider. So depending on the apprenticeship your employee is enrolling on will depend on the provider. So providers can be colleges, universities, or independent training providers. They all have subtle differences, whether that be the way that they deliver the programme, how they do their timetabling, how they do their planning, their communications, but fundamentals should be in place. And this is what I'm trying to outline today. Ultimately, they are responsible for the apprenticeship journey. And I said before that that is from the beginning of the engagement all the way up to the achievement date and that learner receiving that certificate. Lots of training providers kind of duck out after the training time is finished, but ultimately they are responsible for making sure that that learner has achieved and that learner has received their certificate, so they should be staying involved. And then some key individual elements around their involvement should include providing a full and thorough onboarding process with sign up and induction planned, so making sure that every bit of the programme is planned out. This will fall in with the apprenticeship agreement and the commitment statements, but also alongside that a detailed costing model for the training. And this falls back to the previous slide around the breakdown of how that funding is being used. Majority of providers will try and max out the funding band, absolutely within their rights to do, but is it efficient use of money, and should you be charged that top end, whether you're a levy payer or whether or not you're using ESFA funding? It should still be value for money, and making sure that there is detailed costings is really important for you to agree with. There should be a structured delivery plan, training plan, which outlines. Now, obviously, if it's a 5-year programme, they might not be able to guarantee that year 4 teaching days will be the same, but they should be able to plan out the kind of modular approach, how things will be taught, when milestone checks will come in, when assessments will take place, so potentially when the assessor or the mentor will come in and observe the apprentice on site. And all interventions should be planned out in advance. A named point of contact for yourself and the apprentice. Now, this might not be the same person, but it's vital that the apprentice has a named contact, but it's also really important that you do as well. So who are you going to contact if you've got an issue? Who are you going to contact if you've got an issue with the mentor or the coach, if the only contact number you've got is the coach? So is there somebody, is there a business development manager that looks after your contract? Is there somebody internally looking after the quality assurance, and that named contact that you can go to if you have any questions or any niggles or compliments even that you're using? Plan to support the apprentice with functional skills and personal development. Now, flag this as a separate thing just because it can be left, it can be sidelined sometimes, and especially for those learners that are exempt from functional skills, it isn't really thought about. It can be a bit of an afterthought. And also the personal development, so your safeguarding, your prevent, your British values, your equality and diversity are all fundamentals of an apprenticeship programme and are all something that Ofsted come in and manage and monitor. So it's really important that all of that planning is also put into place. And I have put in brackets that this can be delivered and is often delivered through a subcontractor. So a subcontractor is another company that the main provider will bring in to support an element of the training plan. So most commonly it's for functional skills. So you might have a small niche provider that is really good at digital and data or marketing apprenticeships, but they don't have a functional skills department. So they may link up with a subcontractor, a company that has an English and maths team, and they may subcontract out the functional skills for those learners. The main relationship should stay with the provider and yourselves, but you will then have contact with a subcontractor. But again, it's the main provider's responsibility to manage all of that. Effective safeguarding, so making sure that the learner is going to a safe and comfortable working environment, and making sure that they are adhering to all the safeguarding practices that they sign up and are responsible for managing. Regular arranged workplace visits, obviously COVID dependent, and progress reviews, they are audited on this 12-week review. So making sure that those happen every 12 weeks is a fundamental responsibility of a training provider. And then just as a quick visual, just in terms of what an apprenticeship is and how we can get there, obviously an apprenticeship equals substantive new knowledge, skills and behaviours, and that is the benchmark of it being an apprenticeship, is it has to be substantial new knowledge, skills and behaviours. You have to be able to justify at least 12 months worth of learning is needed for that learner to be competent in that occupation. So initial assessments and diagnostics will give you the starting point. That will recognise any prior learning and prior experience, which will then determine how much new knowledge, skills and behaviours are needed. Then we have a tailored learning plan that should be individualised and fully tailored to the individual needs. And this should also take into consideration any additional learning needs. So for example, if there's been an assessment and the learner has identified they have an additional learning need, then that should be added into the programme as to how those additional learning needs will be met. And then reviewing and reconfirming learning through ongoing assessments, retailoring the programme throughout to meet new learner needs or new overall learning objectives. And this is what I say is the commitment statement and the training plan may look beautiful and clean on day one, but it should look lots of different versions and be very different at the end, because we're taking into consideration that learners may learn quicker, they may learn slower, they may need to take a break in learning, they may have to recap something may have happened and they've had to switch to a different project for a little while, so their training plan needs to change. And that's okay, but it needs to be reviewed and it needs to be reconfirmed, and we need to be making sure that that learner is progressing. And all of that all together, fingers crossed, we then get to occupational competency, we get to gateway, and we get to go through to get endpoint assessment, and for that learner to be independently assessed that competence has been met. So a question for you again. So are you confident that your providers are doing this correctly for all of your learners to demonstrate a good return on investment for your levy and funding? And again, I'm not going to ask anybody to say yes or no, but just something to consider. Are you fully happy with all of your providers in every learner that they have enrolled is getting the best experience that they deserve? Okay, so just to talk you through the apprenticeship journey. So what makes up an apprenticeship? People that have been on workshops or webinars with me in the past may have seen a very similar slide, but it's just a really clear visual on what makes up the apprenticeship. So we obviously have our sign up and induction, we have our on-programme learning, we have our gateway, and we have our endpoint assessment. And then for the next few slides, I'm just going to outline where the provider's responsibilities fall and the employer's responsibilities fall in line with the sign up, the on-programme, the gateway and the endpoint assessment. So you'll see on the left-hand side where we've got our sign up and induction. So we've spoke about it before. So confirming eligibility, the costs and the funding, creating this plan of learning, using the starting points, having an induction and making sure that the apprentice fully understands all the requirements of the programme, and then everybody's happy, they all sign the agreements and the commitment statements. So your role, so the provider's role in this is obviously to meet with the employer, discuss the eligibility and the needs, meet with the learners and conduct some what we call an IAG, information, advice and guidance, to make sure that they're committed, that they're ready to commit to this apprenticeship programme. Facilitate initial assessments and diagnostics. So these initial assessments and diagnostics can be for English and maths, but also they should be on the standard that the learner is potentially preparing to enrol on, to determine that starting point in relation to the knowledge, skills and behaviours. Confirming eligibility, so basic, lived in the UK for the past 3 years minimum. Have they already got a qualification at the same level? Is it in the same subject? So there'll be various questions that will be asked throughout this sign-up process to make sure that that learner is eligible for funding. And that's whether or not they're levy funded or ESFA funding. Tailor a learning plan and the costs as per the outcomes, and then negotiate the contracts and the learning plan. And then you will see that very much you are the supporting role. So whereas the provider is responsible for facilitating and setting things up, you are that support mechanism. So supporting the initial assessment, supporting the provider with documentation, scrutinising the learning plan, scrutinising the contracts and agreeing your service level agreements, and then identifying an internal learning mentor and agree who's going to be the review nominee. So you'll see that the provider's responsibility for making sure that the start gets processed as a start and gets accepted. It's your key responsibility to make sure that you're supporting that process, but you're scrutinising it and you're making sure you're happy with what is being agreed. Then we move into on-programme learning. So the apprentice undertakes the programme. The training provider comes and visits, carries out assessments, take part in the reviews, apprentice to be allocated independent study time, employer to support with the shadowing and the training plan, and supporting those functional skills and personal development requirements. So those are all the activities that take place during that on-programme learning. And again, that can be a 12-month programme or a 5-year programme if it's a degree level. So our providers have the responsibility, again, of facilitating and carrying out. So facilitate the learning plan and undertaking all of those responsibilities as set out. Carrying out the workplace assessments as per the learning plan, carrying out the reviews, meeting the KPIs or SLAs, communicating effectively, and leading discussions and supporting the employers with the selection of endpoint assessment. So again, taking that leading role. And then over to the employers in that support capacity. So supporting the apprentice and the provider to work towards the learning plan, supporting with their on and off the job activities and making sure that the learner is being given all the opportunities that they need to develop and to underpin the knowledge that they're learning and to embed the skills that they need. Actively engaging with those communications, having contract review meetings, attending the workplace reviews, but also taking part in those discussions and confirming those endpoint assessment arrangements well in advance. At Gateway, so Gateway, again, as I described earlier on, it's where all parties agree that the learner has met all the requirements, that any qualifications have been met, that all the requirements for Gateway have been achieved, and that the learner is ready and is competent to go through endpoint assessment and pass with flying colours, hopefully. So during this process, the provider and again yourselves have responsibilities. So providers' responsibilities are very aligned with compliance elements. So you'll see everything has a Gateway requirement. So there is a list of requirements that every learner will need to meet, and that will be laid out in the assessment plan for the standard. So the provider is responsible for making sure all those requirements have been met, ensure that all the learning has been achieved and the off-the-job hours have been met. So this 20% needs to be documented, and there needs to be evidence that at minimum 20% has been achieved. Ensuring that the learner is competent and ready to enter, and the only way they're going to know that is by assessing them. So have they planned mocks? Have they done enough on-programme assessments, and have they really seen that distance travelled to make sure that that learner is competent and can confidently go through Gateway and know that they're in the best position to pass their endpoint assessment. Making sure that the learner's happy. Obviously, it's all about the learner at this point, getting them in the best, physical, mental, emotional position to know that they're going to go through endpoint assessment and be really, really good at that on that day. Gather all the evidence that's needed. So endpoint assessment organisations will require evidence, whether that's certificates, eligibility criteria, portfolios, evidence, project plans. So the provider is responsible for making sure all that evidence is ready and can be submitted. It's normally submitted either through an email or through a portal at Gateway, but it's the provider's responsibility to press that button, as you say. Support all parties in readiness. So again, just really emphasising that support element, making sure that all parties are happy with the arrangements that are in place and being that liaison between. Keeping in touch with yourselves and the learner as they go through Gateway and go through endpoint assessment, especially becomes important if there is an element of a fail and they need to retake or resit a part of endpoint assessment. The endpoint assessment organisation may say that the learner needs to come out of Gateway and go back into learning for a time, and then re-enter Gateway at a different time. Normally it's a minimum of 4 weeks that the learner would be asked to go back into learning for. So if that is the case, the training provider will then need to come back in, we'll need to undertake some learning, and then we'll need to repeat all the steps again and resubmit the learner for Gateway. And then fingers crossed, and finally, once everything's been achieved, once all the elements have been sat and passed, then they ensure that the certification arrangements are in place. Now, 9 times out of 10, the certificates will go back to the training provider and they will then distribute them back to you. There are discussions taking place at the moment around some potential changes to certification arrangements, but at present, they normally go to the training provider unless a special request has been put in. But it's then important for you to know where you want them to go. Do you want to keep them for a graduation ceremony, or do you want them just to go to the learner's site? That's an internal discussion to have. And then again, your support role, so supporting the learner through Gateway, making sure that you've provided every opportunity for that learner to be ready. Have you done any internal mocks? Have you worked with the internal mentor and made sure that they're happy that everything's been covered and that learner can pass endpoint assessment? And then having those active roles and engagements during Gateway and during those discussions, making sure that logistically the endpoint assessment organisation can come on site. Is there any health and safety requirements that they need to know about that you need to pass on through the training provider or by talking to the endpoint assessment organisation independently? And then endpoint assessment, just to bring those in. So during, again, we've got our supporting, so keeping in touch with the learner during endpoint assessment and making sure certification's in place, but also support with the timescales from your point of view. Gateway is normally a 3-month process. Some of them need to take 3 months because some work needs to be undertaken only when that learner enters Gateway, whereas there are some standards where you could enter Gateway and then schedule endpoint assessment quite quickly. So it's just being realistic with the timescales and what you can do to support that. And then to bring in the endpoint assessment organisation, so they're involved at the on-programme stage, the Gateway stage, and the endpoint assessment stage, obviously. So their key roles in this is to support the provider, yourselves as the employer, and the learner with any available resources to help prepare for endpoint assessment. Liaise with the training provider to update any planned Gateway dates and provisionally plan time slots. So what you can find is if your learner is on track and you are confident that the learner will be ready to go through Gateway at the date that's been identified, there is no reason why endpoint assessment time slots can't be provisionally booked in, and those can be discussed well in advance. So you could put them in place, and then it would just be the responsibility of the endpoint assessment organisation and the training providers to just keep those dates updated. So if something happens, or if the learner has a bit of a wobble and they want to move it, then obviously that is allowed. The endpoint assessment organisation can approve or reject Gateway. So if the training provider hasn't submitted all the right paperwork, if there is a discrepancy around something, they can reject the Gateway request, and that would then go back to the provider to look at. Obviously, plan the activities, liaising with yourselves and the learner, and then facilitating those endpoint assessment activities, working to agreed timescales to release the results. And this is a really important part of your contracts with them. How long is it going to take for them to mark, quality assure, and get the results out to you? And then process the paperwork for certification and distribute the certificates. So that's kind of where they fall into the journey. So they're involved from that on programme, minimum 6 months before. And obviously they stay involved right until the end and make sure that once the learner's paperwork has been processed, that they're then distributing those certificates out. And some things that I would say around empowering yourselves around endpoint assessment organisations is by asking questions, asking them what their timescales are, how realistic, how busy are they, can they commit to the dates that you're planning? Are they going to be able to get results back, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks? What's realistic for you and your learners? Because there are some good endpoint assessment organisations out there. So please don't feel like you're kind of pigeonholed into one that you need to go down. I would really start to challenge and really start to make sure that you're getting value for money for your endpoint assessment organisations. And then the final section is just on the regulators, and I've mentioned a couple of them during today, but I just thought it'd be useful just for anybody that doesn't understand or doesn't know what the different organisations that are involved in the process. So going around Ofqual. So Ofqual is a government department, and they regulate and accredit examination boards in the UK. So any certificate that you have that is from an awarding body should have Ofqual image somewhere around it, or will have an Ofqual number or a signatory on it. They are now becoming the regulators for all the endpoint assessment organisations. Originally, lots of different organisations, quality assured, apprenticeship standards, but a few years ago it was decided that everything would come under Ofqual, and that transition process is currently happening. Ofsted, scary name if you're a training provider or an employer provider. So Ofsted is a government department who are responsible for inspecting a range of institutions. So they have a framework which currently is called the Education Inspection Framework. They have themes of quality of education, safeguarding, leadership and management, and personal development. And they will undertake inspections of training providers, colleges and universities now, and they will ensure that the apprenticeship provision is being delivered to the expectations of the framework. There are different grades and there are different outcomes. They do have the power to close down providers, and they have closed down in the past. They grade inspections 1 out of 4, and they work with providers, obviously, if they need to improve their provision internally. Office for Students, so OFS, is a non-department public body of the Department of Education. This acts as a regulator and competition authority for the higher education sector. So it's for universities to use the Office for Students. They work very closely with Ofqual, and they're now working closely with Ofsted, now that Ofsted are responsible for observing and inspecting. But Office for Students will inspect HEI providers outside of an apprenticeship remit, and make sure that the establishment is meeting the correct requirements of a university. Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education, better known as IFATE, they are an independent body who approve apprenticeships and technical education qualifications. They're responsible for all the apprenticeship standards and also T-levels and the higher technical qualifications, HTQs. They are who we work with when we are designing new standards or when we're updating standards, and they're also responsible for designing the T-level curriculum and overseeing that linked to the occupational standards, and also more recently the higher technical qualifications for level 4 and 5. So their remit has expanded. They were just Institute for Apprenticeships when they first came out, but technical education has now been added to their remit. And then the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA, are accountable for all the funding that's allocated to education. So they regulate and fund the schools, colleges, universities and training providers, and they manage all of the money in terms of the financial obligations of apprenticeships. So obviously the levy, so you pay that into a levy pot, and once that comes back out as apprenticeship funding, that is regulated by the ESFA. But also for a smaller SME who doesn't pay levy, they will contribute the 95% funding band to apprenticeship training for those businesses and those apprentices. They run audits. Compliance is a massive thing, and it is something that I'm looking to deliver another webinar on in the new year, which will have a compliance focus. And that's just the audit process is to make sure that there are good use of public funds, and it is all public funds through apprenticeship provision. So it's important that yourselves as providers, but also the training providers, are using the money efficiently and effectively, and there's no case of fraud. And that brings the presentation to the end. I hope you've all found it useful. I hope there's been some questions that have potentially poised some elements to yourselves. Happy to answer any questions if anybody has got any. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the session.
Thanks, Rachel, for that really sort of useful, informative session. As I can see, a couple of questions have come through. Just before we get to those questions, just a reminder, really. I know you mentioned it in the session, but so Rachel's got sort of helps a broad range of employers develop sort of successful apprenticeship programs, really, for so whatever stage you're at of your own apprenticeship journeys. It's useful to get in contact and find out about what support and help is available via SIP membership or from Rachel via another guys. And I'll put Rachel, I'll put your if it's okay with yourself, I'll put your email address in the chat section of the webinar as well, so people can see that. First question, I guess, Rachel, is if someone's just looking for more information on the funding rules, if they're not sure whether the funding has been spent correctly, how do they go about finding out that, or is it somewhere?
Really good question. So like I said earlier on, I did a webinar in the summer on the new funding rule, so we can send the links out to that. There is a big meaty document that we can add the link to as well, that has the full funding rules. The funding rules is a document that's over 130 pages long, but it outlines all of the responsibilities. There are some updates and summary guides that can also help, but everything's through .gov.uk.
Excellent, thanks Rachel. And if someone's looking for about endpoint assessment, how do I know who can endpoint assess each standard? Is there something that we can advise them on there?
Yes, definitely. So on the Institute's website, there are, when you click on a standard, to the right hand side towards the bottom of the page, there is an external link that will take you to an endpoint assessment page, which again sits on .gov.uk, and it's a downloadable spreadsheet. They are trying to digitalize it, and at the moment it's an updated document where you can then filter for the standard that you're looking at, and that will come up with a list of providers that are eligible and registered for endpoint assessment.
Excellent, thanks Rachel. And I've just posted links to both those pages that you mentioned in the chat section there. The other thing worth mentioning for attendees is, as this webinar closes, there'll be a short survey, which is literally no more than three or four questions, I think, and take a couple of minutes to complete. It's really useful, and it's just really useful to understand what future topics you might want to hear about in the world of apprenticeships as well. So be really grateful for your feedback on that point. So unless there's anything else, I'll say thank you for attending, and Rachel, thank you for taking the time out to take us through that presentation today, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much.